The bitter wind of a late Oregon autumn tore through the shattered window pane of the old kitchen, howling like a grieving specter. But the freezing gale was nothing compared to the icy panic clutching Nora Montgomery's heart. Clad in a soot-stained midnight blue silk dress that belonged in a Virginia ballroom rather than a ruined stone hut, the 20-year-old threw her weight against the rusted iron stove door, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs. 5-year-old Lily sat huddled on a rotted wooden crate in the corner, her tiny body trembling under a thin woolen shawl as her tear-filled eyes locked onto her sister. If Nora couldn't clear the choked, ash-clogged flue within the next 10 minutes, the suffocating black smoke billowing into the room would force them back out into the freezing night where Mrs. Hattie Thorne stood waiting to march them onto the next stagecoach out of Oak Ridge Estate. Nora grabbed an iron poker, her breath blooming in white plumes in the drafty room. She swung the tool up into the dark throat of the chimney, her plump, soft hands aching from the unaccustomed strain. A heavy avalanche of dry soot-bird nests and old pine needles cascaded down into the hearth, narrowly missing her face and dusting her fine silk bodice in a layer of charcoal gray. She coughed, blinking through the stinging air. But she didn't falter. She couldn't afford to. With a sharp, resolute blow, she dislodged the final blockage. The chimney drew with a sudden roaring breath, sucking the dark cloud up toward the rafters and leaving a clear, cold draft in its wake. Nora knelt before the iron hearth, her chest heaving as she struck a friction match against the stone. She touched the flame to a handful of dry pine shavings she had gathered from the woodpile. A bright orange blossom of fire licked the kindling, crackling with immediate life. The radiant heat began to push back the bone-chilling dampness of the stone floor. "Look, Lily Bug," Nora whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She turned to her sister, forcing a warm, reassuring smile to her lips. "The fire is alive. We have light." Lily sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. Her velvet dress, once a proud garment tailored in Richmond, was now noticeably short at her ankles, a silent testament to how quickly time had moved while their world fell apart. She scrambled off the crate and rushed into Nora's arms, burying her small face in the silk fabric of Nora's shoulder. "Is Papa really not coming to fetch us?" Lily sobbed softly, her small fingers clutching the blue silk. "Why are we in this dark place, Nora? I want to go home." The question pierced Nora deeper than any cold wind ever could. She closed her eyes, holding her sister tight, and breathed in the faint scent of lavender soap that still lingered on Lily's hair. Home was gone. Richmond, Virginia was a distant memory of a life that felt like a dream. Just 3 months ago, Arthur Montgomery had been the most respected tobacco merchant in their district. He had doted on his daughters, celebrating Nora's generous, curvy figure and her passion for the culinary arts while showering little Lily with every luxury a child could desire. But Arthur had carried a fatal secret, a mountain of catastrophic debts born from failed shipping ventures. When a sudden heart attack claimed his life in his study, the creditors descended like vultures. Within 2 weeks, the family estate was liquidated, the carriages sold, and the servants dismissed. Nora was left with a single carved cedar trunk, 3 of her mother's finest silk gowns, her mother's leather-bound recipe ledger, and exactly $11. More than the loss of wealth, Nora carried the immense weight of a promise made at her father's bedside that she would protect Lily at all costs. When an advertisement appeared in a Richmond paper seeking an assistant cook at Oak Ridge Estate in Oregon's Willamette Valley, Nora spent her last dollars on coach tickets, traveling thousands of miles across a rugged continent to secure a roof over her sister's head. A heavy, deliberate footstep crunched against the gravel outside, shattering the quiet moment. The heavy oak door creaked open, framing the stern, towering figure of Mrs. Hattie Thorne. The 55-year-old housekeeper stood wrapped in a dark wool cloak, her graying hair scraped back into a severe bun. Her sharp hazel eyes swept across the stone room, taking in the soot-smudged blue silk dress, the cedar trunk resting near the wall, and the little girl clinging to Nora's waist. "So you managed to light the stove?" Hattie said, her voice dry as dead leaves. She stepped inside her boots, making a loud thud on the floorboards. "I expected to find you crying on your trunk, waiting for the evening coach." Nora stood up slowly, keeping Lily behind her skirt. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin despite the dirt on her cheek. "I promised I would prepare the kitchen for tomorrow's harvest meals, Mrs. Thorne. The old kitchen is clean enough to sleep in tonight, and the fire is drawing." Hattie scoffed, stepping closer to inspect the cedar trunk. A city girl with soft hands wearing a dress meant for a plantation ball, dragging a 5-year-old child to a working cattle ranch. Mr. Pendleton hired an assistant cook, not a fallen-to Thu who thinks this estate is a charity house. You won't last a week when the frost hits the valley. My hands are stronger than you think, Mrs. Thorne, Nora replied, her tone even though her eyes flashed with quiet defiance. And my sister is no burden. She will stay here in the old kitchen while I work. Hattie eyed the fire roaring in the hearth, then looked at the fierce determination in the young woman's eyes. Something flickered in the housekeeper's cold expression, perhaps surprise or perhaps an even deeper suspicion. We shall see, Hattie grunted, turning toward the door. Breakfast for 20 ranch hands must be ready in the main hall at 6 sharp tomorrow morning. The flour sacks and salt pork are in the cold pantry. If you fail to serve them on time, you and your sister will be on the morning coach back to Portland. No second chances. Without another word, the housekeeper stepped back into the dark night, slamming the heavy door behind her. Nora let out a long breath, listening to Hattie's footsteps fade into the distance. She turned back to the warmth of the stove, her mind already racing. She knew Hattie expected her to fail. The main pantry supplies would be coarse and the ranch hands were used to bland heavy rations. But Nora had her mother's recipe book, a mind trained in organization, and a hearth that was finally burning bright. She reached down, unbuckling the brass latches of the carved cedar trunk. Among the folded silk gowns lay her mother's worn leather ledger and a small pouch of dried herbs she had carefully preserved. She looked at Lily, who was watching her with wide, trusting eyes. We have a roof tonight, Lilybug, Nora said softly, kneeling beside her sister and tucking a stray curl behind the girl's ear. Tomorrow we show them that we are here to stay. As the winter wind howled across the Willamette Valley, rattling the wooden shutters, the fire in the old kitchen cast a golden glow across the stone walls, marking the first stand of the Montgomery sisters against the cold world outside. By 5 o'clock the following morning, a thick silver frost coated the valley, but the stone walls of the old kitchen were already humming with soft heat. Nora had risen long before the sun, her body aching from the thin straw mattress on the floor, yet her mind remained razor-sharp. She smoothed down her midnight blue silk dress, now protected by a heavy canvas apron she had scrubbed clean at dawn, and pinned her dark hair firmly out of her face. Beside the hearth, little Lily was still fast asleep, bundled securely beneath Nora's wool coat, with a small tin of warm water nearby to keep the chill away. Nora pressed a quick kiss to her sister's forehead before stepping out into the biting morning air, determined to face the main hall's pantry. The main hall was dark and silent when Nora entered, her boots making no sound on the heavy oak floorboards. In the pantry she found exactly what Hattie Thorne had promised. Sacks of coarse flour, rock-hard salt pork, dried beans, and a bin of bruised, neglected apples from the late autumn harvest. It was a cold, unyielding selection meant to test her, but Nora smiled softly. To an untrained eye, it was meager ration work. To someone raised in a kitchen where every ingredient held a purpose, it was a blank canvas. Nora carried an armful of supplies back to the old kitchen, preferring to work over her own drawing hearth. With swift, practiced movements, she trimmed the rancid rind from the salt pork, dicing the good meat and rendering the fat down in a massive iron skillet until it crackled. Instead of simply boiling the coarse flour into heavy leaden biscuits, she used the warm, rendered fat and a splash of buttermilk she found stored in the stream house to yield a light, flaky dough. Into the sizzling pork fat she tossed finely chopped apples and wild sage she had gathered from the riverbank the previous afternoon, creating a savory sweet gravy that filled the stone building with an intoxicating rich aroma. At 5:45, the heavy wooden doors of the main hall creaked open and the first wave of ranch hands shuffled in, stamping the frost from their heavy boots. They were weathered, tired men, hardened by weeks of clearing timber and mending fences before the winter snows set in. At their head was Old Tom, the veteran livestock hand, whose gnarled hands and silver beard spoke of 40 years spent on the Oregon frontier. Behind him lagged Toby, a skinny 10-year-old orphan boy with hollow cheeks and eyes far too old for his face, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large. When Nora stepped into the dining hall carrying 2 massive iron platters, a quiet hush fell over the room. The men stared first at the sight of a plump, graceful young woman in a tailored silk dress beneath a flour-dusted apron, and then at the food. Instead of the gray lumpen porridge they had endured for months, before them sat mountains of golden-brown biscuits smothered in a rich, glistening gravy accompanied by pan-fried apples that smelled of autumn spice. Lord in heaven! Old Tom muttered, taking a hesitant step forward. Did the stagecoach drop an angel off at the gate? Nora offered a quiet, welcoming smile as she set the platters down on the long pine table. Breakfast is served, gentlemen. Eat while it's hot. Toby didn't wait. The young boy reached out, grabbing a biscuit with trembling fingers, and took a massive bite. His eyes widened, his small shoulders relaxing instantly as he chewed. It tastes like home, the boy whispered, a streak of flour smudging his dirty cheek. Nora felt a swell of warmth in her chest as she watched the men dig in with ravenous gratitude. She filled a wooden bowl with gravy and biscuits, walking over to hand it directly to young Toby. Take your time, Toby. There's plenty more in the kitchen. As the men ate, the door to the housekeeper's office clicked open, and Mrs. Hattie Thorne emerged. The older woman stood frozen near the threshold, her sharp eyes scanning the scene, expecting to find disgruntled ranch hands complaining about a failed city girl. She instead saw her crew eating in joyful silence, scraping their plates clean. Her gaze drifted to Nora, who was standing calmly by the sideboard, checking her hand-drawn inventory ledger. Hattie marched toward the table, her leather boots snapping against the floorboards. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "I gave you standard rations, girl. Where did you get the fruit and spices? Have you been raiding the winter storehouse without my permission?" Nora turned to face the housekeeper without flinching. She pulled a small, neatly written ledger from her apron pocket and presented it to Hattie. "I used precisely 3 pounds of salt pork and 6 pounds of flour from your pantry. Mrs. Thorne, exactly the allowance you noted. The apples were taken from the cull bin in the orchard that was marked for rot, and the herbs were foraged along the creek. I wasted nothing. In fact, by using the pork fat instead of butter, I saved 2 pounds of dairy for your winter reserves." Hattie snatched the ledger, her eyes scanning the neat, elegant handwriting. Every ounce of flour, every scrap of meat was accounted for with mathematical precision. The housekeeper's jaw tightened, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and rising frustration. She couldn't accuse Nora of incompetence, nor could she claim she was wasteful. Before Hattie could find another flaw to criticize, the heavy oak front door opened once more, and a cold gust of wind swept into the hall. The room grew instantly quiet as a tall figure stepped over the threshold. It was Arthur Pendleton, the owner of Oak Ridge Estate. Broad-shouldered and cloaked in heavy dark wool, Arthur was a man who moved like a shadow across his own land. At 38, his face was handsomely structured but lined with deep, permanent grooves of sorrow. Ever since a tragic fever had claimed his wife and 5-year-old daughter 3 winters ago, Arthur had withdrawn from the world, leaving the management of the estate largely to Hattie while he buried himself in work at the far edges of the ranch. Arthur paused, sensing the unusual atmosphere in the room. His gray eyes swept over the empty platters, the satisfied faces of his men, and finally landed on Nora. His gaze lingered on her plump, poised figure, taking in the contrast of the fine midnight blue silk dress beneath the canvas apron and the calm, steady intelligence in her eyes. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Thorne?" Arthur asked, his voice a deep, quiet baritone that carried easily across the room. Hattie stiffened, quickly closing Nora's ledger. "No, Mr. Pendleton. The new assistant cook was merely reviewing the morning kitchen report." Nora stepped forward, slightly curtsying with quiet dignity. "Good morning, Mr. Pendleton. I am Nora Montgomery." Arthur looked at her for a long moment, nodding once with distant courtesy. "Miss Montgomery, the food smells remarkable." His eyes drifted past her toward the doorway that led to the courtyard, where little Lily was now standing timidly, holding the wooden frame and peeking inside, her small hand clutching a rag doll Nora had made for her. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. For a fraction of a second, his composure fractured, a look of raw, unhealed grief flashing across his dark eyes as he stared at the little 5-year-old girl in her short velvet dress. He closed his eyes briefly, forcing the pain back down into the dark corners of his heart before turning his attention back to Nora. "Make sure the storehouses are secured by noon," Arthur said quietly to Hattie, though his voice lacked its usual icy detachment. "The air from the Cascades is turning bitter. A heavy frost is settling early." "I have already noted it, sir." Nora spoke up, her voice clear and grounded. Arthur turned back to look at her, surprised by her interruption. Nora met his gaze squarely. "The wool on the sheep in the south pasture has grown exceptionally thick this month, sir. And the pine cones along the river have fallen early and hard. My mother's journals noted these exact signs in Virginia during the Great Freeze of '78. The storm coming down from the Cascade Range will not be a simple frost. It will be a blizzard, and it will arrive before the week is out. If we do not double the timber supply at the old kitchen and move the grain sacks to the high stone barn, Now we will be cut off when the roads freeze." Hattie let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "Nonsense. The autumn weather in Oregon is unpredictable, girl. We have 2 weeks at least before—" "She is right," Arthur interrupted, his gray eyes locked onto Nora with a sudden sharp intensity. He had noticed the signs himself during his rounds on the ridge, but he had not expected a city-bred woman in silk to possess such keen observation. "Move the grain to the high barn today. Double the wood loads for every hearth on the property, starting with the old kitchen." Arthur gave Nora one final lingering look, a mixture of intrigue and a deep dormant respect before turning on his heel and stepping back out into the gathering cold. Nora watched him go, feeling a subtle shift in the air. She knew the storm was coming, but as she looked at her sister playing safely near the threshold and felt the strength in her own hands, she knew they were no longer just surviving. They were building a fortress against the coming ice. By Wednesday evening, Nora's warning proved prophetic. A dark, terrifying wall of clouds rolled down from the Cascade Mountains, swallowing the Willamette Valley in a blinding white tempest. Heavy, howling gusts rattled the timber frames of Oak Ridge Estate, burying the roads under 4 feet of dense snow within hours. Outside, the world was a freezing wasteland, but inside the stone walls of the old kitchen, the air was warm with the scent of simmering beef broth, toasted barley, and dried apples. Nora stood near the roaring iron stove, her midnight blue silk dress protected by her canvas apron. Beside her, young Toby sat on a wooden stool, grinning broadly as he helped 5-year-old Lily construct small towers from dried corn cobs. Lily's laughter chimed like a small silver bell against the storm outside, filling the stone room with an innocent joy it had not known for decades. Thanks to Nora's foresight, the old kitchen was stacked high with dry cedar logs, and the pantry bins were fully stocked. The heavy oak door suddenly burst open, admitting a swirl of screaming wind and fine white snow. A tall figure stepped inside, slamming the door shut against the gale. It was Arthur Pendleton. He wore a heavy wool coat coated in ice, his face pale from the bitter cold, and his dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He had spent the last 6 hours out in the blizzard, ensuring the cattle were secured in the lower pastures. "Mr. Pendleton," Nora exclaimed, setting down her stirring spoon, "come quickly to the fire." Arthur shook the snow from his collar and stepped toward the hearth, his boots thudding softly against the floor. As he removed his frozen leather gloves, he looked around the old kitchen in quiet amazement. He had expected to find cold stone and desperate misery. Instead, he had entered an oasis of light warmth and life. Little Lily looked up from her corn cobs, her wide brown eyes gazing curiously at the tall, shivering man. Without a word of fear, the little girl picked up a small, warm honey biscuit Nora had baked earlier and walked directly to Arthur. She held it out in her tiny hand. "For you, sir," Lily whispered sweetly, "so your hands don't freeze." Arthur froze his hand, trembling, as he reached down to accept the biscuit. Looking into Lily's innocent face, the ice around his heart shattered completely. She was 5 years old, the exact age his own daughter Clara had been when the fever took her 3 years ago. A sudden silent tear tracked down Arthur's weathered cheek, melting the frost on his skin. He knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to Lily's level, and took a small bite of the biscuit. "Thank you, little one," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is the best thing I have tasted in a very long time." Nora watched the exchange quietly, her heart aching for the grief-stricken man, yet swelling with a profound tenderness. In that quiet moment, a deep, unspoken bond formed between them, a silent understanding between two souls who had lost everything they loved, yet refused to let the cold world harden their hearts. Arthur stood up, his gaze meeting Nora's with a new, quiet warmth. "Your warning saved 30 head of cattle tonight, Miss Montgomery. If we hadn't moved the feed and wood on Monday, we would be facing ruin." Before Nora could answer, a frantic pounding echoed at the door. Old Tom burst in, breathless and pale, his beard frosted with ice. "Mr. Pendleton, come quick." The wind blew over a lantern in the secondary storage barn. "The north wall is catching, and the salt barrels and seed grain are inside." Arthur's face hardened instantly. The salt and seed grain were the lifeblood of Oak Ridge Estate. Without them, the ranch could not survive the winter or plant in the spring. Tom grabbed the shovels. "We must smother it with snow before it reaches the main haylofts." As Arthur turned to rush back out into the blizzard, Nora acted on pure instinct. "Toby, stay here with Lily. Keep the door locked," she commanded firmly. Nora grabbed a heavy wool shawl, wrapped it around her shoulders, and rushed out into the roaring storm right behind Arthur. The wind hit her like a physical blow, tearing at her silk skirts, but she pressed forward through the deep snowdrifts toward the burning barn. Orange flames were leaping up the cedar shingles of the storage barn's northern wall, filling the dark, freezing night with thick, acrid smoke. Arthur and Old Tom were frantically hurling snow against the flames, but the wind was feeding the fire, pushing it toward two 50-pound wooden barrels of curing salt resting near the burning wall. "The salt will be ruined," Arthur shouted over the roar of the gale. "We can't get close enough, the smoke is too thick." Nora didn't hesitate. Soaking her wool shawl in a bucket of meltwater near the trough, she held it over her nose and mouth and charged directly into the smoke-filled barn. Her eyes stung and her lungs burned, but her mind remained fierce. She reached the heavy salt barrel, wrapped her arms around the rough oak staves, and leveraged her weight. Using every ounce of strength in her sturdy frame, she heaved the 50-pound barrel backward, dragging it across the floorboards away from the spreading heat. Arthur, seeing her inside the smoke, let out a desperate shout and plunged in after her. He seized the second barrel, rolling it out into the snow, just as a burning rafter collapsed with a shower of sparks directly onto the spot where the barrels had rested moments before. Together, using shovels and massive banks of heavy snow, Arthur, Nora, and the ranch hands contained the blaze, extinguishing the final embers just as the storm reached its peak. Soaked, exhausted, and covered in soot, Nora collapsed onto a dry crate just inside the main barn doors, gasping for clean air. Her fine silk dress was ruined, singed at the hem and blackened with ash, but her eyes shone with absolute triumph. Arthur walked over to her, his own face smeared with soot. He looked down at the young woman who had just risked her life for his estate, his heart pounding with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He knelt in front of her, taking her small, soot-stained hands in his own. "You are incredible, Nora," Arthur said softly, using her first name for the very first time. His gray eyes were intense, filled with admiration and profound gratitude. "I have never seen such courage." Nora looked into his eyes, feeling a warm flush spread across her cheeks despite the bitter cold. "We protect what is ours, Mr. Pendleton," she replied quietly. "Call me Arthur," he whispered, pressing her hands gently. As they walked back through the storm toward the glowing light of the old kitchen, Arthur kept his arm firmly around Nora's waist to steady her against the wind. Inside, Lily ran into Nora's arms, and Arthur watched over them with a look of quiet, fiercely protective devotion. The storm raged on outside, but within the walls of Oak Ridge Estate, the dark winter had lost its power. The morning sun broke over the Willamette Valley in early March 1886, casting brilliant golden rays across the snowmelt rivers and the swelling green buds of the apple orchard. The great winter storm that had once threatened to consume Oak Ridge Estate was now a memory, leaving behind a land reborn under the soft touch of spring. Inside the warm, brightly lit pantry of the main hall, Nora stood before the open ledger books, her dark hair neatly pinned and her hands moving swiftly across the pages with ink and quill. A soft knock sounded at the door before Hattie Thorne stepped into the room. The older woman appeared changed. The severe defensive tension that had once marked her features was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity. Hattie held a small leather pouch containing $50 silver, the remainder of the money she had secretly diverted over the past year to support her starving widowed sister in post-war Richmond. "I have the last installment for the estate books, Miss Nora," Hattie said softly, her voice carrying a deep, genuine respect. "If you turn these over to Mr. Pendleton, I will pack my trunk and leave on the noon stagecoach." Nora set down her quill and looked gently at the housekeeper. Months ago, when Nora had uncovered the discrepancy in the winter ledgers following the blizzard, she had not exposed Hattie to Arthur or demanded her dismissal. Instead, Nora had sat down with the desperate woman, listening to her story of family hardship, and helped her construct a quiet, manageable repayment plan through extra-preserving work in the dairy. "There is no need for packing trunks, Mrs. Thorne," Nora replied, offering a warm smile as she pushed the pouch gently back across the wooden table. "Mr. Pendleton reviewed the updated ledgers yesterday. He knows of your arrangement, and he agrees that your 30 years of dedication to Oak Ridge far outweigh a mistake born of desperate love for your family. The debt is settled, and your place here is secure." Hattie's eyes welled with sudden grateful tears. She bowed her head, unable to speak for a moment, before pressing Nora's hand with profound gratitude. "You brought grace back into this house, Nora. God bless you." As Hattie left to oversee the spring cleaning in the main hall, Arthur Pendleton stepped out from his private office holding a heavy parchment document, stamped with the official seal of the county court. His dark eyes were soft as he looked at Nora, his posture erect and purposeful. "Mrs. Thorne speaks the truth," Arthur said, walking toward her ledger desk. Grace, foresight, and unyielding strength, that is what you brought to this valley, Nora. He laid the parchment on the desk before her. It was a formal decree appointing Nora Montgomery as the chief administrator of Oak Ridge Estate, granting her full authority over the property's management, supplies, and staff welfare, accompanied by a generous annual salary. Arthur, this is too much. Nora breathed, her fingers tracing the crisp black ink. It is less than you deserve, Arthur replied firmly, his voice rich with emotion. You saved my men from cold and hunger. You saved my seed grain from the fire, and you saved me from my own darkness. He extended his hand, inviting her out into the spring sunlight. Nora accepted, wrapping a light shawl over her midnight blue silk dress, the very dress that had survived soot, smoke, and snow, now worn as a proud badge of her resilience. They walked together out into the blooming orchard, where the air was sweet with honey and blossoming petals. A short distance away, young Toby was laughing loudly as he pushed 5-year-old Lily on a wooden swing suspended from a sturdy oak branch. Lily's cheeks were rosy with health, her laughter echoing through the valley like sweet music. She was no longer the frightened, shivering orphan from the frozen hearth. She was a happy, cherished child surrounded by a family that loved her. Arthur paused beneath the shade of a towering apple tree, turning to face Nora. The lingering shadows of grief that had once darkened his gray eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a deep, steady warmth. He took both of her hands in his, feeling the soft, strong grip that had anchored his life through the winter. When I lost my family 3 years ago, I thought my heart was buried in the cold earth forever, Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly with raw sincerity. I believed Oak Ridge was merely a place to endure until my own time came. But then you arrived in your fine silk dress, holding your little sister's hand, refusing to break before the storm. You lit a fire in a frozen stone room, and in doing so, you lit a fire in my soul. Nora looked up into his handsome face, her heart beating with a deep, serene joy. You gave us a home when we had nowhere else to go, Arthur. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a clear blue sapphire shimmering like the skies over the Willamette Valley. Nora, he whispered, looking into her eyes with total devotion, I do not offer you a life of luxury, but I offer you my heart, my complete respect as your partner, and a lifetime of devotion to you and little Lily. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and letting me be a true father to your sister? Tears of pure happiness glittered in Nora's eyes. She thought of her late father, Arthur Montgomery, and knew he was looking down with pride, knowing his daughters were safe, loved, and triumphant. Yes, Arthur, Nora answered softly, stepping into his warm embrace. Yes, with all my heart. Arthur slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her close, kissing her tenderly beneath the falling apple blossoms. Nearby, Lily caught sight of them, letting out a delighted squeal as she ran across the grass, her small arms wrapping around both of their skirts. Arthur leaned down, lifting Lily easily into his arms and holding both Montgomery sisters tight against his chest. Later that afternoon, as the golden twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and rose, Nora sat at the wooden desk near the open window of the old kitchen. Lily lay fast asleep on a soft feather bed in the corner, her rag doll tucked tightly under her chin. Nora opened her mother's worn, leather-bound recipe ledger to the very first blank page. Picking up her father's silver pen, she dipped it in dark black ink. She looked out at the peaceful orchard, at Arthur walking toward the doorway with a lantern to guide his way home, and began to write the first line of their new life, spring 1886. The fire in our hearth burns bright, and home is wherever love resides.